I know that when I became an atheist in 2001, it was, or I'm sorry, 1997, it was cool, essentially. I mean, to me it was anyways. And you had, and I'm not saying this to be a geek, but this literally Star Trek had a profound influence on the way my atheism formed. This is going to sound goofy, but I actually wanted to be a Vulcan. I had a brief phase where I tried to purge my emotions. And that seems silly, but Star Trek has always been an atheistic, naturalistic worldview show. And I think that because the height of Trek was in the 80s and 90s. So I would actually argue that in the 90s, if you look at pop culture, if you look at political culture, if you look at, and I read one article in Politico where he studied the statistics that you had, that religiosity, as it were, was still, the stats show that in the 90s, church attendance was still at over 80% in America. And the nuns, quote unquote, the not affiliated with any traditional religion, were very small at that time. But are we maybe arguing that the transition was beginning to happen there, where very popular shows like Trek, and Doctor Who was kind of the same, right?
Doctor Who is always more implicitly than explicitly, but sure, yeah.
Yeah, so Doctor Who, Trek, Babylon 5, all of these 90s, early 2000s era sci-fi that were so influential. Are we going to say that maybe there was a transition taking place in the popular mind at that time, that the shows were both reflecting and driving?
Well, it's interesting because one can ask the question, what came first as far as the, how do I say this, the consequences or the symptoms of this atheistic strain, or a move away from traditional religion, right? Because I think personally, the sexual revolution had a lot more to do with the kind of the breakdown of traditional religion in America than avowed atheism. Because I think this is what we still have today, where people are very willing to accept supernatural realities. Most people are, except for the really smart people. They're not really willing to do so. But most people are very willing to accept the existence of supernatural realities. But it kind of moves right up until it hits to the groinal issues, and then when that hits, that's kind of the number one issue I see. So I think back in the day, you had a far more conservative culture, even if the social conservatism was just kind of a veneer over a lot of underground hedonism. It was still the societal expectation. And now we've flipped completely, where the kind of baseline expectation is about sex, and we live in a very sexualized culture. And so it's weird, as people who've talked to a lot of people not in the Christian faith, where Christians believe a lot of strange things, a lot of very strange things. But kind of the first thing you get with someone who, especially younger people, it's not about the miracles. It's not about scripture, really. It's not about the fantastical movements of God and the life, whatever would have you, the personal witnesses. It's mostly about what about the gays, and as a Catholic, the priests doing something very evil pertaining to sex, right? And so I don't think people thought about religion this way, but they do nowadays. So it's interesting to see what came first. I had another thought about that, but that's maybe a point for later. The other thing I will say is Star Trek was an American show, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Doctor Who is British. And so it's interesting to see Europe. I think it was the wars that did this. It wasn't necessarily intellectualism that drove people from the churches. It was just the cultural decay of traditional religion in Europe, to the point where nowadays England is basically an atheistic country. I mean, they have higher rates of atheism than America or anywhere in the world, maybe except for Asia. And you have something like the coronation of King Charles. where, you know, the divine right of kings or whatever, kind of this idea that's still floating around when we see the pageantry of a coronation. But you're sitting here and you're thinking, most of the people in the church begging God's grace over God's ordained monarch no longer believe in God. And